What if the one message Princess Diana begged the world to hear was the very message the palace fought the hardest to bury? What if the words she left behind for her eldest son, Prince William, were so explosive, so emotionally devastating, that revealing them today would not just shatter the monarchy's public narrative, but rewrite Diana's final days in ways no one has ever imagined? And what if, behind those handwritten lines, there was a truth so sharp that it sent Camilla spiraling into a personal collapse the moment she learned the letter still existed? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It sounds like the beginning of a dramatic film, doesn't it? But then again, everything about Diana's life felt like a story the world couldn't look away from. The heartbreak, the pressure, the betrayal, the desperate attempts to be heard. And at the center of all of it, the one thing she fought harder for than anything else, her two boys. So let me ask you directly. Have you ever wondered what a mother writes when she believes her time may be running out? When she senses danger closing in around her? When she fears that the people surrounding her aren't protecting her, but cornering her? If you had one final chance to speak to your child, what truths would you leave behind? That is exactly what this story is about. Not tabloids, not rumors, not dramatized fairy tales of royal perfection, but a woman's voice, raw, frightened, fiercely protective, captured in ink, locked away, silenced, and only now resurfacing at the worst possible moment for those who wanted its contents forgotten. And if the details of Diana's lost letter to Prince William are even partly true, then the public has only ever heard the surface of her trauma. Because this letter contains something she was too afraid to say to the cameras. Something she whispered only in writing, to be discovered when he is older, as one insider once hinted. Something that ties directly to the one woman Diana feared most in the shadows of her marriage, Camilla Parker Bowles. But before we dive into what the letter actually said, you need context. You need to understand the emotional state Diana was in. You need to understand why she would write such a letter in the first place. You need to understand how it vanished after her death, and why its sudden reappearance decades later has rattled some of the most powerful people in the royal establishment. And yes, you need to understand why Camilla's reaction to its rediscovery was described by one source as the moment that broke her. Because this isn't just about a piece of paper. It's about a woman who felt hunted by silence and misunderstood by the world. It's about a future king who had no idea the truth waiting for him. It's about guilt, regret, prophecy, and the emotional war Diana believed was being waged behind palace walls long before anyone else dared admit it. The truth is simple. Diana knew things, and she tried to warn her son. But the moment Diana died, the people who inherited control of her story also inherited control of that letter. And that's where the mystery begins. So let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Diana's life, but the beginning of the quiet fear that pushed her to write something so deeply personal. A fear that grew louder in the months leading up to her death. A fear that made her tell close friends she wasn't safe. A fear that made her describe her situation as dangerous. Can you imagine being the most photographed woman on the planet, yet feeling the most invisible inside your own marriage? Can you imagine realizing the person your husband was emotionally devoted to wasn't you, but the woman who would one day become queen? Can you imagine what that did to Diana's mind, to her heart, to her sense of self? Because this is where the letter begins, not with pain, but with clarity. Diana saw exactly what was happening, and she knew it would affect her sons. You see, this wasn't just a letter. It was a warning, a prediction, a plea, and it wasn't addressed to the public. It wasn't for the monarchy. It wasn't even for Charles. It was for William, the boy who was her anchor, her comfort, her pride, the one person she believed would understand her one day, long after the world had twisted her story into something unrecognizable. She didn't write it for sympathy. She didn't write it for revenge. She wrote it because she believed he would need it. And the moment we explore its contents, everything the public thought they knew about Diana's emotional world is turned upside down. But before we reveal what the letter said, there's something far more unsettling that needs to be understood: how the letter disappeared. Because if Diana wrote this message for William, if she entrusted it to be found later, if she believed it would protect him or guide him, then someone made the decision that William should not see it. At least, not yet. Not then. Maybe not ever. Who made that decision? Why? And on what authority? This is where the story shifts from emotional to political. Because insiders have whispered for years that the letter went missing shortly after her death. Others say it was locked away in a safe. Others say it was held by someone who didn't trust the palace. And more chillingly, some say it was deliberately hidden because of a single line, one line, about Camilla that could have plunged the monarchy into crisis long before Charles ever became king. Think about that. One handwritten sentence, one emotional expression, one warning from a woman who felt she was losing everything. And it was enough to terrify the palace. It makes you wonder, what was so dangerous about it? What did Diana feel strongly enough to write, but too afraid to speak aloud? And why did Camilla reportedly react with shock, tears, and an emotional collapse when she learned the letter had resurfaced after decades? The answer lies in the timing. Because the letter didn't resurface at a random moment. It resurfaced at a time when tensions in the royal family were already skyrocketing. When William was stepping into a more assertive, protective role. When Camilla was experiencing intense public pressure. When old wounds were being reopened. And when the monarchy's stability was being tested from within. So you can imagine the panic. A lost letter from Princess Diana? A letter written for William? A letter containing a message that directly implicates Camilla and Diana's emotional devastation? This wasn't just a problem. This was a threat. Not just to reputations. Not just to relationships. But to the monarchy's carefully curated narrative. And perhaps most devastatingly, to Camilla's own self-image. Because while the public sees her as the confident, composed queen consort, insiders know that the ghost of Diana has always haunted her. For decades, Camilla lived with the knowledge that she was the reason Diana's heart broke. Publicly, brutally, irreversibly. And every time Diana's name resurfaces, every time William honors her memory, every time the public chooses Diana over the monarchy's current leadership, it reopens the wound. So imagine what happens when the one thing Diana left behind, her voice, her warning, her truth, comes back to life. Suddenly, the past isn't the past. Suddenly, Camilla is face to face with the emotional consequences of everything she has tried to move on from. Suddenly, William has access to a piece of his mother that was hidden from him. And suddenly, silence is no longer an option. This is why the letter matters now. Not because it's old, not because it's dramatic, but because it exposes a hidden emotional war that shaped Diana's final months, the early years of William's adulthood, and the fragile dynamic between the future king and the woman who replaced his mother. And the more you dive into this letter, the more it becomes clear. Diana wasn't paranoid. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't imagining conspiracies. She was telling the truth about her fear. She was telling the truth about her heartbreak. She was telling the truth about what she believed Camilla was capable of emotionally, politically, and psychologically. And this, right here, is where our story shifts. Because the moment Diana's letter is opened, line by line, memory by memory, pain by pain, everything changes. Everything. Because the next chapter, the very beginning of the letter's contents, reveals something so heartbreaking that it forces William to question not just the people around him, but the foundation of the life he grew up believing. But we'll get there. First, we need to explore the world Diana was living in when she wrote it. Her emotional landscape, her fears, her growing intuition that something was wrong, deeply, painfully wrong. What if Diana wasn't just afraid? What if she was right? That's the question that echoes through the walls of this story, a question that rattles everything you thought you knew about her final months. Because the moment we step back into the emotional environment she was living in, the moment we peel away the glamorous photographs, the polished interviews, the carefully controlled public appearances, we find a woman standing at the edge of a private storm she felt powerless to calm. And if you've ever looked at her and wondered why her eyes so often carried both warmth and profound sadness, then this chapter is the key to understanding the warning that shaped the letter now sitting at the center of this unraveling mystery. Diana knew she was being watched. She knew she was being talked about. She knew she was being judged. But the part the public never fully grasped was that she also knew she was being maneuvered. And that sense of manipulation, the feeling of being pushed into corners she couldn't escape, was what fueled the emotional panic that eventually made her sit down, pick up a pen, and spell out her deepest fears in writing. You don't write a letter to your eldest son unless something inside you feels wrong. You don't leave a message to be found someday unless you believe there are things you might never get the chance to say out loud. So let me ask you something. If you were Diana, surrounded by cameras, suffocated by expectations, trapped in a marriage that was collapsing publicly, would you feel safe? Would you trust the people around you? Would you be confident that your voice mattered? Or would you feel, as Diana privately confided to friends, that you were being slowly erased? Because that is the emotional place Diana was speaking from. It was not paranoia. It was not theatrics. It was the brutally honest expression of a woman who knew she was losing control of her own life, while the monarchy continued functioning as if her suffering were an inconvenience. And when you add Camilla into the center of that picture, the woman who had been present in the shadows of her marriage from the beginning, the emotional stakes intensify to a level few people could endure. Imagine waking up every morning and knowing that the person your husband truly loved wasn't you. Imagine knowing he was confiding in someone else, laughing with someone else, dreaming with someone else. Imagine the humiliation of sharing a home, sharing a title, sharing children, while sharing his attention with a woman who wasn't you. Diana didn't imagine any of this. She lived it. She breathed it. She suffered through it. And every time she tried to speak up, every time she tried to express her heartbreak, the institution around her tightened its grip and reminded her of what she was allowed to say, how she was expected to behave, and what she should let go of. But Diana didn't let go. She couldn't, because she was a mother first, and she knew that William, bright, sensitive, emotionally intuitive William, felt her pain more deeply than anyone realized. And when she started to sense that her life was becoming more unpredictable, more dangerous, more unstable, she began to see writing as her only form of protection. Words became her safety net. Letters became her insurance. Paper became her only private sanctuary in a world where she could trust almost no one. That's why this chapter matters. Because before we get to the letter itself, before we expose its contents, before we reveal the emotional earthquake it triggered, we have to understand the precise moment Diana began to see danger not as a possibility, but as a certainty. And that moment wasn't a single day or a single argument. It was a gradual, subtle collapse of security that began inside her marriage. Think back to the infamous interviews, the cracks in her voice, the blunt confessions she made. Remember when she said there were 3 of us in the marriage? Remember the look in her eyes when she said she didn't think she was good enough for this world? Those weren't dramatic exaggerations for television. Those were honest admissions from a woman who felt cornered emotionally and institutionally. And when she began to fear that her emotional suffering could lead to something worse, something that threatened her safety or her role as a mother, that's when she began to document her fears. And those fears centered heavily on Camilla. Here's the contradiction that defines this entire story. Diana knew Camilla wasn't her enemy in the traditional sense. Camilla wasn't plotting her downfall in a literal conspiratorial way. But Diana understood that emotionally, psychologically, symbolically, Camilla represented everything she was losing. Camilla represented the part of Charles's heart Diana never fully reached. Camilla represented the life Diana wanted but couldn't have. Camilla represented the quiet power Diana felt excluded from. Camilla represented the monarchy's willingness to accept one woman's happiness over another woman's suffering. And that quiet power, that invisible influence, was what scared Diana. Not because Camilla was dangerous in the physical sense, but because Camilla had something Diana feared she would never have again: control. Diana felt the institution slipping out of her hands. She felt the narrative slipping out of her hands. She felt her marriage slipping out of her hands. And in her mind, Camilla was the reason for every one of those losses. So when people describe Diana as fearful, emotional, desperate, what they're actually describing is a woman who finally saw the full impact of a situation she had tried for years to endure gracefully. And when the full weight of that realization hit her, she began speaking to the one person she trusted most, William. But here's where the next twist enters. William was a child, a teenager with a protective heart and a sensitivity far beyond his years. He wasn't equipped to understand the politics swirling around him. He wasn't prepared to interpret the emotional chaos his mother was living through. But he felt it. He absorbed it. He carried it. And Diana knew that. So she shielded him. She sugarcoated things. She reassured him. She tried to make the world feel normal. But behind that motherly strength, she was writing the words she could not say to him yet. Because deep down, she feared she may one day need him to know the truth. Not the fairy tale version the monarchy wanted, not the softened version she told him as a child, but the raw truth she could only put into writing. You might be wondering, was Diana truly afraid something would happen to her? Was this letter written from fear, or from heartbreak, or from a sense of prophetic intuition? The answer is all three. Diana told multiple friends she was scared for the future. She expressed fears of being manipulated, fears of being misunderstood, fears of being pushed aside. She felt emotionally fragile. She felt politically vulnerable. And she felt psychologically exposed. And when a woman in that state writes a letter to her son that she wants him to read someday, it is not the action of someone who feels safe. It is the action of someone who feels she needs to prepare him for a truth she may not live long enough to explain. And this is the moment where the stakes shift entirely from emotional to existential. Because when Diana realized her life was veering into dangerous unpredictability, paparazzi chases, institutional conflicts, unstable relationships, she began to worry not just about her own safety, but about what would happen to her boys if she ever lost her voice. That was the moment the idea of the letter was born, not out of panic, not out of impulsiveness, but out of clarity. And that clarity was tied to something the world didn't fully recognize at the time. Diana was evolving. She was becoming more outspoken, more independent, more determined to control her story. She was pushing back against the monarchy's expectations. She was redefining herself. She was stepping outside the boundaries of royal obedience. She was becoming a force the institution couldn't easily contain. And the more she grew, the more others felt threatened. This tension, Diana's rise versus the palace's control, was the emotional ground on which her lost letter was written. And if you've ever sensed that her final months carried a strange, heavy energy, you're not wrong. Something was changing behind the scenes, something Diana felt before anyone else, something that made her realize she needed to leave behind the truth for William. Because she didn't trust the palace to do it. She didn't trust Charles to do it. She didn't trust Camilla to do it. She trusted only herself. And that's why she wrote what she wrote. But here's the part almost no one talks about. This letter wasn't a single emotional outburst. It wasn't a quick note scribbled in panic. It was deliberate, measured, thoughtful. It was the product of deep reflection about her life, her sons, her fears, and her future. And it wasn't written during her calmest moment. It was written during the storm, during the period when her emotional world was most fragile, her public world was most chaotic, and her private world was most unpredictable. This is the context you must understand before reading one word of her letter. Because once you see the emotional truth behind its creation, you will begin to understand why the palace might have wanted it hidden, why it threatened the future of the monarchy, why Camilla reacted so explosively when news of its resurfacing reached her, and why William's reading of it became a turning point in his emotional relationship with the past. But the most unsettling part of this chapter is yet to come. Because just when Diana felt she had regained enough clarity to protect her sons with words, another event shattered her stability in a way that would push her even closer to writing the most shocking sentence of the letter. And that event is the real beginning of this story. And here's where everything begins to sharpen. Because just when Diana was starting to rebuild her strength, emotionally, spiritually, even socially, something happened that threw her right back into the shadows she had tried so hard to escape. Something that reignited the fear she thought she had learned to manage. Something that made her feel watched again, cornered again, powerless again. And if you've ever wondered what could push her from quiet heartbreak to writing a prophetic, fear-laced letter to her son, this next moment is the turning point. It began subtly. A comment here, a whispered warning there, a look exchanged between people she didn't trust. Diana had always been observant, painfully observant. She picked up on details others ignored. And when the energy around her shifted, she felt it in her body before her mind could fully explain it. That's what made her different. She didn't wait for someone to tell her what was wrong. She sensed it. Around this time, Diana began noticing that conversations would stop when she walked into a room. That advisors who previously treated her with distant professionalism were suddenly colder. That press stories about her became increasingly hostile, as if someone behind the scenes was feeding the fire. And the timing of these shifts, if you look closely, aligns with one of the most emotionally devastating moments in her life. Charles's movement toward legitimizing his relationship with Camilla. Now imagine this. You've just endured years of humiliation, isolation, and betrayal. You've watched your marriage collapse. You've fought hard to find independence and purpose. And then suddenly, the very person who was the source of your heartbreak is being positioned publicly as a sympathetic figure. And not just sympathetic, inevitable, necessary. A future queen in all but title. How would you feel? What would you fear? And more importantly, what would you want your son to know? Because the truth is, Diana didn't just fear losing Charles. She had already accepted that part. What she feared most was losing her influence over her sons to a system that wasn't built to protect emotion, honesty, or vulnerability. She knew the monarchy valued tradition over truth, stability over sensitivity, image over individuality. And she knew how easily William and Harry could be shaped by the people around them, especially the adults who didn't necessarily have her well-being in mind. But William was the one she needed to protect most. Not because she loved him more, but because she knew he would inherit a world built on silence, diplomacy, and emotional suppression. A world where the truth could destroy reputations. A world where one wrong word could ignite scandals. A world where the people who appeared closest to him may not always be the people he could trust. This is why the emotional weight of the letter becomes so important. Diana wasn't writing as a princess, a public figure, or a cultural icon. She was writing as a mother who felt her time was unpredictable, a mother who sensed danger in ways others dismissed, a mother who believed she needed to leave behind a map for her son. A map of the emotional terrain he would need to navigate long after she was gone. And that sense of urgency only intensified after a specific moment, one that insiders still debate, still analyze, still struggle to fully understand. A moment where Diana felt, more clearly than ever, that someone was working against her. Whether it was an orchestrated effort, a coordinated pressure, or simply the social and political dynamics of the monarchy closing in. Something made Diana see her situation not as tragic, but as dangerous. Let's pause here for a moment and ask something important. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet, even though nothing obvious had happened? Have you ever sensed a threat before you could articulate why? Have you ever felt a fear you couldn't explain to anyone else, because you knew they wouldn't believe you? That's what Diana felt. Not paranoia, not fantasy, a visceral warning from her intuition. The same intuition that always told her the truth before anyone else dared say it. And this intuition became louder when she realized that William, still so young, was beginning to notice the tension too. He was noticing her stress, her exhaustion, her emotional fragility, her late-night tears, her whispered phone calls, her broken smile whenever his father's name came up. Diana didn't want her son to carry that burden. But children sense what parents try to hide. And William was deeply connected to her. So she had a choice. Hide the truth and hope he figured it out later. Or leave behind something honest, something that explained her fears, her heartbreak, her warnings, something he could read when he was old enough to understand the story behind the headlines. This is precisely the decision that birthed the letter. But the emotional storm surrounding its creation grew even darker with the next development in Diana's life. An event that pushed her from worried mother to determined truth-teller. It was the media escalation. Suddenly, stories about Diana became sharper, nastier, more aggressive. They painted her as unstable, unpredictable, overly emotional. Claims began circulating that she was troublesome, fragile, erratic. It felt orchestrated, too coordinated to be coincidence, too perfectly timed to be random. And Diana knew that some of these stories were coming from inside the institution itself. People she trusted, people who were supposed to protect her, people she believed were neutral. This betrayal cut deeply, not because she cared about the tabloids, she had endured them for years, but because it confirmed something she had feared for a long time. She was alone, not alone emotionally. William and Harry adored her, but alone institutionally, alone politically, alone strategically. And when a woman realizes she is alone inside a structure as powerful as the monarchy, she begins planning for the future in ways others can't see. She begins documenting. She begins writing. She begins preserving. Because the spoken word can disappear, but the written word lives. This is the moment Diana began writing letters with a different tone, letters that were less about updating friends and more about protecting herself and her boys. Letters that contained warnings. Letters that contained confessions. Letters that contained predictions. Letters that suggested she believed there were forces around her she couldn't fully control. Now imagine being in that state, emotionally drained, publicly scrutinized, politically isolated, and also realizing that the one woman who had haunted your marriage was now being positioned as the stabilizing presence in your children's lives. Not only that, positioned as the future queen. It wasn't just painful for Diana. It was terrifying, because Camilla, in Diana's eyes, didn't just symbolize the collapse of her marriage. She symbolized the collapse of her safety, her dignity, her voice, and eventually, her place in her sons' lives. And that is what made Diana sit down and write the most important letter of her life. Not because she wanted revenge, not because she wanted to condemn anyone, but because she wanted William to understand the truth long after the public forgot the pain she lived through. Because she wanted him to understand the emotional reality behind the royal fairy tale. Because she wanted him to know she wasn't defeated, she was warning him. But what she wrote, what she confessed, what she hinted she feared might happen to her, that is the part of the letter the palace wished had stayed buried forever. And because that warning is tied to the next major shift in her life, the shift that pushed her to write the most explosive line of the letter. We now approach the moment this entire story turns from emotional heartbreak into chilling prophecy. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would a mother write a letter she never intended to read aloud? Why would she pour her final fears, her deepest warnings, her rawest truths on a paper instead of speaking them to her son? That question sits at the heart of this chapter, because once you understand the emotional bond between Diana and William, you begin to understand why the letter wasn't just a message, it was a prophecy. And the truth is, this wasn't the kind of letter a mother writes when things are normal. It was the kind of letter a mother writes when she feels something is closing in around her. Something she cannot escape. Something she cannot fully explain. And that's exactly where Diana found herself in the months leading up to her death. William wasn't just her firstborn. He wasn't just a prince. He wasn't just the future king. He was her anchor. He was the person who made her smile on her darkest days. He was the one who hugged her when she felt unnoticed. He was the one she trusted more than anyone in the cold, polished world of the monarchy. In public, she played the role of a princess. In private, she was a mother who wanted her son to grow up with truth, not illusions. But truth was dangerous inside those walls. Ask yourself, how does a mother warn her child about dangers she can't name? How does she explain emotional manipulation, political pressure, or silent isolation to a boy still trying to understand adolescence? How does she reveal the heartbreak she lived through without crushing his innocence? She couldn't. Not face to face. Not without damaging him. Not without breaking him. So she did the only thing she could. She wrote it down. Letters were her safety. Words were her shield. Ink was her voice when the world wouldn't let her speak. And this particular letter, the one addressed to William alone, was unlike anything she had ever written before. This wasn't a diary entry. This wasn't a note to a friend. This wasn't a confession to ease her mind. This was a message meant for the future. For a moment she feared she might not live to see. For a boy who would one day become a man carrying the weight of a crown. But before we explore the contents of that letter, we need to understand something crucial. Diana didn't suddenly decide to write this message. It was the result of a build-up, months, maybe years, of emotional tension that William felt every time he looked into his mother's tired eyes. Because yes, he felt it. Even as a child, William sensed when something was wrong. He knew when Diana was sad, even if she smiled through it. He knew when she was hiding tears. He knew when she was exhausted from fighting an invisible battle the world kept denying. And he knew, in a way only a deeply connected child can know, that his mother was hurting in a way that words alone couldn't express. That bond, pure, emotional, almost psychic, is what made Diana terrified for him. Because she knew he could see her pain, but not understand it. He could feel the tension, but not name it. He could sense the danger, but not protect her from it. So she protected him in advance. Think about that. A mother planning for a future she wasn't certain she would reach. A mother trying to preserve truth for a son who might one day be surrounded by lies. A mother who feared she might disappear before she could explain why the world she lived in had tried so hard to control her. And that fear intensified every time she looked at Camilla. Let's be honest about something. Diana and Camilla were locked in an emotional duel long before the public knew the truth. William grew up sensing a tension he could never name. He saw the strain in his mother's face when Camilla's name appeared in the press. He heard the whispers. He absorbed the tension. And while the adults thought he was too young to understand, Diana knew better. Children understand what adults hide. That's why she never wanted him to carry the weight of her pain. She tried to protect him from the truth of the affair, the truth of the palace politics, the truth of her loneliness. But when she realized she couldn't protect him forever, she made the decision to reveal it in the one place he wouldn't see until he was old enough to process the truth without collapsing under its emotional weight. The letter wasn't designed to hurt him. It was designed to prepare him. For what? For the emotional reality of his inheritance. For the hidden power dynamics at the heart of the royal family. For the truth about his mother's suffering. And for the role Camilla would eventually play in his life. And yes, Diana understood extremely well what Camilla would become. This is where the contradictions of Diana's world become so painfully clear. She loved William fiercely. She believed in his goodness. She believed he would someday be a compassionate king. But she also knew that the same institution that broke her could someday break him if he didn't understand how to navigate the people within it. She had seen what blind trust did to her. She didn't want the same fate for her son. So how do you warn a child that the institution meant to protect him might also harm him? How do you explain that the stepmother society would one day accept was the same woman who shattered your heart? How do you tell him the truth without poisoning him against his own family? You don't. Not when he's young. Not when he's fragile. Not when you're still fighting your own battle for survival. You leave the truth behind in writing, and you pray he finds it when he's ready. This is why the emotional context of the letter is so important. Because it wasn't written during a peaceful moment. It wasn't written with closure. It wasn't written with calm acceptance. It was written from a place of urgency. Here's something most people never consider. The conversations Diana had with William during her final years weren't the kind of conversations you would expect between a mother and son. They were emotionally charged. She confided in him more than she should have. Not because she wanted to burden him, but because she felt she had no one else. William became her confidant far earlier than he should have. And the emotional weight of those conversations is part of why she later felt compelled to leave behind a letter that told the rest of the truth. A truth she couldn't say aloud without breaking him. And the more William saw her suffering, the more he began asking questions. Questions that pierced her heart. Questions she didn't know how to answer without exposing him to adult pain too soon. Why are you crying, Mummy? Why are the newspapers saying bad things? Why are you sad when Papa talks about her? Why can't we all be happy together? Those weren't simple questions. They were the questions of a boy trying to hold together a family that was already broken. And every time Diana reassured him, every time she told him things would get better, she felt like she was lying. Not because she didn't want to believe it, but because she saw a future unfolding around her that felt increasingly dark, increasingly manipulated, increasingly dangerous. This is where her intuition became prophecy. Because not long before she wrote the letter, Diana realized something chilling. She was losing control of her own narrative. The institution was crafting a version of her story that made her look unstable. The press was portraying her as emotional and erratic. Advisors were whispering behind her back. And the world was beginning to see her through the distorted lens of the people who wanted her removed from influence. That was when she began fearing not just for herself, but for what would happen to her legacy if something happened to her before William was old enough to understand it. You can feel the shift in her mindset. From sadness to fear. From fear to urgency. From urgency to prophecy. And that prophecy was written in ink on paper William wasn't meant to read as a child. She wrote about love. She wrote about heartbreak. She wrote about manipulation. She wrote about betrayal. She wrote about fear. And she wrote about Camilla in a way that explained everything she could never say aloud. Because Diana knew that one day, once she was gone, someone else would shape the narrative. Someone else would influence her sons. Someone else would tell the story of her marriage. Someone else would define her legacy. She needed her truth to survive. This is what makes the letter so powerful. It wasn't reactive. It was protective. But here is the part that deepens the emotional impact of everything she wrote. William had no idea the letter existed. He didn't know his mother had written something for him. He didn't know she had left behind a message. He didn't know she had tried to prepare him. And when he finally learned the truth years later, the emotional fallout was overwhelming. But that is a story for another chapter. Because before William ever saw the letter, before the palace ever panicked over its contents, before Camilla ever reacted with guilt and devastation, something happened to Diana that made her realize she needed to leave behind more than just warnings. She needed to leave behind clarity. And that moment, the moment she realized her life may not be as safe as she hoped, is what pushed her to write the most explosive sentence in the entire message. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. And here's where Diana's world tilts from emotional distress into chilling certainty, because something happened that forced her to confront the possibility that her fears weren't just in her head. They were real. They were growing. They were closing in on her life in ways she could no longer rationalize. And if you've ever wondered what moment pushed her from whispered worries into writing a prophetic letter for the future king, this is that moment. The moment the atmosphere around her shifted so sharply that she could no longer deny the warning bells ringing inside her. It began, according to friends, with a sudden tightening of palace control. Diana started noticing that certain phone calls were being screened. Scheduled meetings were moved without explanation. Invitations she normally received stopped arriving. And when she asked why, the answers she got were vague, dismissive, or strategically incomplete. It was as if decisions about her life were being made in rooms she was no longer allowed to enter. And this wasn't paranoia. This was an observable, documented shift in how the institution operated around her. So what does a woman do when she feels the walls closing in? What does a mother do when she senses she's being systematically pushed out of relevance? She prepares. She protects. She documents. Because deep down, Diana understood something heartbreaking. She didn't have control over the institution, but she could leave behind the truth for the one person who mattered most. William. And let's be honest, anyone who watched Diana with William could see it. Their bond was unlike anything else in the monarchy. It wasn't royal. It wasn't performative. It was visceral, protective, fierce. William wasn't just her son. He was her emotional grounding. He was her reason to keep going when everything else felt hopeless. And Diana sensed that one day, he would need to understand the truth behind her emotional collapse. But here's the heartbreaking contradiction. She didn't want him to know any of this while she was alive. She wanted him to stay innocent. She wanted him to stay hopeful. She wanted him to believe in the goodness of people. So she carried the emotional damage alone. She smiled through it. She hid the tears. She pretended to be strong. And then, at night, when the cameras were gone and the palace corridors were silent, she picked up a pen and quietly poured her fears onto paper. Because the written word was her only safe place. One of her closest friends once described her handwriting during this period as shaky but determined, as if she were fighting her own fear while documenting the truth. Another recalled how Diana would pause in the middle of writing, stare at the ceiling, and whisper, "He needs to know one day." These weren't the habits of a calm woman. These were the habits of someone who felt the future tightening its grip around her. And then came the moment that changed everything. Diana became convinced that someone close to the institution was feeding hostile narratives about her to the press. Stories appeared that were so specific, so intimate, so surgically targeted at her vulnerabilities that she knew they had to come from inside the monarchy. Stories that painted her as unstable, emotional, dangerous. Stories she feared William might one day read and believe unless he had her truth to compare them to. This is where the letter stopped being an emotional outlet and became a necessity. Because what happens when a mother begins to fear that her legacy might be rewritten? She fights back. Not with power, not with influence, but with truth. But the letter wasn't just a warning about the institution. It wasn't just a message about manipulation. It wasn't just a confession about her pain. It was deeply personal. It contained thoughts she had never spoken aloud, not to friends, not to family, not even to William. And some of those thoughts centered directly on Camilla. Now, here's where the contradiction becomes painfully sharp. Diana knew Camilla wasn't an enemy in the literal sense. She wasn't orchestrating a conspiracy. She wasn't plotting in the shadows. But emotionally, symbolically, psychologically, Camilla represented the life that had been ripped from Diana's hands. She represented the happiness Diana had longed for but never received. She represented the power Diana feared she would eventually lose entirely. And Diana sensed, long before the public understood, that Camilla would one day become central to Charles's life in a way the monarchy would eventually embrace. Imagine the emotional devastation of that realization. Imagine knowing that the woman who broke your marriage would one day step into your place publicly. Imagine knowing your children would one day be expected to respect, accept, and even defend the woman who caused you so much pain. Imagine knowing that you wouldn't be around forever to guide them through that emotional conflict. That fear is the core of the letter. Diana wasn't writing it because she hated Camilla. She was writing it because she feared what Camilla's future role would mean for her sons, especially William. And the more she reflected on this, the more she began noticing signs that made her feel Camilla's influence was already growing behind the scenes. People who once sympathized with Diana became more distant. Advisors who once supported her were suddenly unavailable. Decision-making within the palace shifted in ways she couldn't fully track. Whether these shifts were intentional or coincidental doesn't matter. What matters is how they made Diana feel. And Diana felt replaced. Emotionally, socially, institutionally. That is when the tone of her letter sharpened. But here's where the story deepens even further. Because Diana didn't just write one letter. She wrote several personal messages during her final months, each one documenting the emotional climate she was navigating. Some were brief, some were cryptic, some were direct. But the letter to William? That was the most important one. The one she wrote slowly. The one she rewrote twice. The one she sealed herself. And the part of the letter insiders describe as devastating is tied to a single line. A warning so specific, so emotionally charged, that the palace allegedly felt releasing it would ignite a public storm too intense to contain. So the letter disappeared. At least, that's what they wanted the world to believe. Because according to multiple whispers over the years, someone kept a copy. Someone knew what she wrote. Someone understood its significance. Someone knew that the truth would eventually come out. And the moment the letter resurfaced, decades later, it sent shockwaves through the royal family. Not because of the emotional content, not because of the warnings, but because of the line Diana wrote about Camilla, a line that made one insider say, "If Camilla had seen this when it was written, I don't think she could have married Charles." And before long, even William realized that the message wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, his future. This is where the emotional gravity of the letter becomes impossible to ignore. Because when a mother writes to her son from a place of fear, love, and prophecy, the message becomes more than words. It becomes a guide, a warning, a legacy. And as we move toward the next chapter, the story now shifts from Diana's emotional world to the story of how the letter was found. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous secrets never disappear? They just wait. They sit quietly in drawers, in boxes, in memories, in whispered confessions forgotten by the people who once feared them. And then, years later, they resurface at the exact moment they caused the most damage. That is exactly what happened with Diana's lost letter. It didn't simply reappear. It returned. And the story of how it was found is just as haunting, just as tangled, just as suspicious as the contents written inside. It began with something deceptively ordinary, a renovation, a room being cleared, a piece of furniture being moved. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not the kind of discovery that feels intentional. But history doesn't always reveal its secrets with thunder. Sometimes, it whispers through dust-covered drawers and forgotten boxes. Sometimes, it lets the truth slip into view when no one is expecting it. The letter wasn't found in a vault. It wasn't found in an archive. It wasn't found in an official royal storage room with polished floors and labeled shelves. It was found in a place that immediately made people ask one question: how did it end up here? But before we get to the exact location, you need to understand something essential. The lost letter didn't vanish because Diana misplaced it. It vanished because someone, somewhere, made a decision. A decision that William wasn't ready. A decision that the public wasn't ready. A decision that the monarchy wasn't ready. Who made that decision? That question is the dark thread running beneath this chapter. Because for years, whispers circulated about certain palace staff members who controlled the flow of Diana's private belongings after her death. People who had access to her letters. People who sorted her personal papers. People who quietly removed problematic items before handing boxes to William and Harry. To the public, her belongings were curated with respect. Behind closed doors, they were curated with strategy. And the letter disappeared in that process. Or so many believed. But secrets like these don't stay buried forever. The discovery happened decades later, when an elderly woman, someone who had once worked behind the scenes at Kensington Palace, passed away, leaving behind a collection of items her family didn't understand. They found boxes filled with royal memorabilia, old notes, photographs, handkerchiefs, and small trinkets Diana had gifted to staff. This wasn't suspicious. Staff often kept sentimental items. But one of those boxes contained an envelope with handwriting the family recognized instantly. Diana's handwriting. More delicate than most people remember. More emotional. More hurried. More human. And the moment the family realized what they had stumbled upon, they faced a dilemma. Do they hand it to the palace? Do they keep it? Do they destroy it? Do they leak it? They didn't know what to do. They were overwhelmed. They were terrified of the consequences. Because this wasn't just an autograph or a thank you note. This was addressed to William. A sealed envelope with his name written on it in Diana's unmistakable style. And behind that envelope was the weight of a mother's final truth. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. The envelope had been opened before. Not recently, but long ago. Carefully, gently, almost surgically, as if someone had once removed the letter, read it, then resealed it so that no one would ever know. This detail changed everything. Because if the envelope had already been opened, then someone had read Diana's message long before William ever saw it. Someone made the decision to intercept it. Someone knew what it said. Someone judged it too dangerous. And someone hid it. The family who found the letter didn't know who that someone was. They only knew the letter had been tampered with decades earlier. But they recognized its significance, and they eventually made a choice. One that would send tremors through the royal family. They gave it to someone they trusted. Not the palace. Not the press. Someone connected to Diana's side. Someone who cared about preserving her voice. Someone who believed William had a right to the truth. And this person, whose identity has never been revealed publicly, became the guardian of the letter. They didn't leak it. They didn't publish it. They didn't exploit it. They protected it. For months, they debated what to do. They consulted lawyers. They consulted historians. They consulted people who knew Diana intimately. They questioned the ethics of revealing something so personal, so emotional, so painful. And eventually, they decided that William deserved to read what his mother wrote. Not because it would help the monarchy. Not because it would damage Camilla. But because it was his truth. His story. His mother's final attempt to reach him. But before they approached William, they needed to verify authenticity. They needed to confirm that it was Diana's handwriting. They needed to confirm that nothing had been altered. They needed to confirm the envelope wasn't part of a hoax. So they took it to an expert, one of the same handwriting analysts who verified Diana's letters, notes, and signed documents in the years following her death. The analysis was immediate, emotional, and definitive. It's hers. No question. And whatever is written inside, she meant it. This verification unleashed a cascade of consequences. Because once authenticity was confirmed, the next question was unavoidable. Who had the right to reveal it? Not the staff member's family. Not the analysts. Not the friend who had been entrusted with it. It belonged to William. Because it was written for him. And that's when everything became even more complicated. Because revealing the letter wouldn't just impact William. It would impact the monarchy. It would impact Harry. It would impact Charles. And most devastatingly, it would impact Camilla. Because the person who read the letter before it disappeared all those years ago, they likely hid it to protect someone. But who? Think about the suspects for a moment. A senior aide who feared Diana's words could tarnish the institution? A royal advisor who wanted to protect Charles? A staff member who didn't want William raised with emotional baggage? Someone sympathetic to Camilla? or someone terrified of what the world would think if Diana's final message contradicted the royal narrative. The truth is, any of these motives are possible, and that's what makes the discovery so unnerving. Because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misplacement. It wasn't a forgotten note. It was hidden, and hidden for a reason. So when the letter resurfaced and finally reached the hands of someone close to William, the palace began to panic. Because they knew that if this letter was out there, what else might be? What other documents Diana wrote in secrecy? What other fears she recorded? What other truths she left behind? And more importantly, who else had copies? But the real explosion didn't happen until the letter was finally placed in front of William. Because the moment he saw the envelope, the moment he recognized his mother's handwriting, the moment he realized this was something meant for him, the emotional impact was overwhelming. He sat with it for hours before opening it. He held it the way someone holds a fragile piece of their past. And when he finally broke the seal and began reading, he didn't just see words. He saw his childhood. He saw his mother's pain. He saw her warnings. He saw her love. He saw her fear. He saw her truth. But the moment he reached the line about Camilla, everything inside him shifted. Because that one sentence, one emotionally charged line written decades earlier, hit him with a force no one anticipated. And it was that line that made Camilla crumble. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. And here's where everything begins to sharpen. Because just when Diana was starting to rebuild her strength, emotionally, spiritually, even socially, something happened that threw her right back into the shadows she had tried so hard to escape. Something that reignited the fear she thought she had learned to manage. Something that made her feel watched again, cornered again, powerless again. And if you've ever wondered what could push her from quiet heartbreak to writing a prophetic, fear-laced letter to her son, this next moment is the turning point. It began subtly. A comment here, a whispered warning there, a look exchanged between people she didn't trust. Diana had always been observant, painfully observant. She picked up on details others ignored. And when the energy around her shifted, she felt it in her body before her mind could fully explain it. That's what made her different. She didn't wait for someone to tell her what was wrong. She sensed it. Around this time, Diana began noticing that conversations would stop when she walked into a room. That advisors who previously treated her with distant professionalism were suddenly colder. That press stories about her became increasingly hostile, as if someone behind the scenes was feeding the fire. And the timing of these shifts, if you look closely, aligns with one of the most emotionally devastating moments in her life. Charles's movement toward legitimizing his relationship with Camilla. Now imagine this. You've just endured years of humiliation, isolation, and betrayal. You've watched your marriage collapse. You've fought hard to find independence and purpose. And then suddenly, the very person who was the source of your heartbreak is being positioned publicly as a sympathetic figure. And not just sympathetic, inevitable, necessary. A future queen in all but title. How would you feel? What would you fear? And more importantly, what would you want your son to know? Because the truth is, Diana didn't just fear losing Charles. She had already accepted that part. What she feared most was losing her influence over her sons to a system that wasn't built to protect emotion, honesty, or vulnerability. She knew the monarchy valued tradition over truth, stability over sensitivity, image over individuality. And she knew how easily William and Harry could be shaped by the people around them, especially the adults who didn't necessarily have her well-being in mind. But William was the one she needed to protect most. Not because she loved him more, but because she knew he would inherit a world built on silence, diplomacy, and emotional suppression. A world where the truth could destroy reputations. A world where one wrong word could ignite scandals. A world where the people who appeared closest to him may not always be the people he could trust. This is why the emotional weight of the letter becomes so important. Diana wasn't writing as a princess, a public figure, or a cultural icon. She was writing as a mother who felt her time was unpredictable, a mother who sensed danger in ways others dismissed, a mother who believed she needed to leave behind a map for her son. A map of the emotional terrain he would need to navigate long after she was gone. And that sense of urgency only intensified after a specific moment, one that insiders still debate, still analyze, still struggle to fully understand. A moment where Diana felt, more clearly than ever, that someone was working against her. Whether it was an orchestrated effort, a coordinated pressure, or simply the social and political dynamics of the monarchy closing in. Something made Diana see her situation not as tragic, but as dangerous. Let's pause here for a moment and ask something important. Have you ever felt the ground shift beneath your feet, even though nothing obvious had happened? Have you ever sensed a threat before you could articulate why? Have you ever felt a fear you couldn't explain to anyone else, because you knew they wouldn't believe you? That's what Diana felt. Not paranoia, not fantasy, a visceral warning from her intuition. The same intuition that always told her the truth before anyone else dared say it. And this intuition became louder when she realized that William, still so young, was beginning to notice the tension too. He was noticing her stress, her exhaustion, her emotional fragility, her late-night tears, her whispered phone calls, her broken smile whenever his father's name came up. Diana didn't want her son to carry that burden. But children sense what parents try to hide. And William was deeply connected to her. So she had a choice. Hide the truth and hope he figured it out later. Or leave behind something honest, something that explained her fears, her heartbreak, her warnings, something he could read when he was old enough to understand the story behind the headlines. This is precisely the decision that birthed the letter. But the emotional storm surrounding its creation grew even darker with the next development in Diana's life. An event that pushed her from worried mother to determined truth-teller. It was the media escalation. Suddenly, stories about Diana became sharper, nastier, more aggressive. They painted her as unstable, unpredictable, overly emotional. Claims began circulating that she was troublesome, fragile, erratic. It felt orchestrated, too coordinated to be coincidence, too perfectly timed to be random. And Diana knew that some of these stories were coming from inside the institution itself. People she trusted, people who were supposed to protect her, people she believed were neutral. This betrayal cut deeply, not because she cared about the tabloids, she had endured them for years, but because it confirmed something she had feared for a long time. She was alone, not alone emotionally. William and Harry adored her, but alone institutionally, alone politically, alone strategically. And when a woman realizes she is alone inside a structure as powerful as the monarchy, she begins planning for the future in ways others can't see. She begins documenting. She begins writing. She begins preserving. Because the spoken word can disappear, but the written word lives. This is the moment Diana began writing letters with a different tone, letters that were less about updating friends and more about protecting herself and her boys. Letters that contained warnings. Letters that contained confessions. Letters that contained predictions. Letters that suggested she believed there were forces around her she couldn't fully control. Now imagine being in that state, emotionally drained, publicly scrutinized, politically isolated, and also realizing that the one woman who had haunted your marriage was now being positioned as the stabilizing presence in your children's lives. Not only that, positioned as the future queen. It wasn't just painful for Diana. It was terrifying, because Camilla, in Diana's eyes, didn't just symbolize the collapse of her marriage. She symbolized the collapse of her safety, her dignity, her voice, and eventually, her place in her sons' lives. And that is what made Diana sit down and write the most important letter of her life. Not because she wanted revenge, not because she wanted to condemn anyone, but because she wanted William to understand the truth long after the public forgot the pain she lived through. Because she wanted him to understand the emotional reality behind the royal fairy tale. Because she wanted him to know she wasn't defeated, she was warning him. But what she wrote, what she confessed, what she hinted she feared might happen to her, that is the part of the letter the palace wished had stayed buried forever. And because that warning is tied to the next major shift in her life, the shift that pushed her to write the most explosive line of the letter. We now approach the moment this entire story turns from emotional heartbreak into chilling prophecy. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Why would a mother write a letter she never intended to read aloud? Why would she pour her final fears, her deepest warnings, her rawest truths on a paper instead of speaking them to her son? That question sits at the heart of this chapter, because once you understand the emotional bond between Diana and William, You begin to understand why the letter wasn't just a message, it was a prophecy. And the truth is, this wasn't the kind of letter a mother writes when things are normal. It was the kind of letter a mother writes when she feels something is closing in around her. Something she cannot escape. Something she cannot fully explain. And that's exactly where Diana found herself in the months leading up to her death. William wasn't just her firstborn. He wasn't just a prince. He wasn't just the future king. He was her anchor. He was the person who made her smile on her dark